Hello, I'm Peter. I'm so glad you could join me for tonight's journey. They say the Norsemen feared nothing, but archaeological records show us they didn't pray for victory in battle. They prayed for the sun to return. Why were the fiercest warriors in history terrified of the dark? Imagine a cold that doesn't just bite your skin, but settles in the marrow of your bones. A cold where the ocean itself turns into jagged walls of stone. Forget the horned helmets and the shouting. The true battle of the North was fought in total silence. Before we step into that darkness, let's mark our path. Hit the like button to leave your footprint in the snow and subscribe so you don't get lost in the drift. Pull that blanket higher. It's time to go where the heat of the sun is just a memory. One mistake with your fire, and you wouldn't just get cold. You simply wouldn't wake up. Let that settle in for a moment, because we're about to step into a world where sleep wasn't the peaceful surrender we know today. It was a calculated risk, a gamble against the dark and the cold, and the very real possibility that morning might never come. Forget the firelit cabins Hollywood sold you. Forget the romantic images of Vikings sitting by roaring hearths, laughing over mead, their cheeks rosy with warmth. Forget the gentle snowfalls and the cozy furs draped artfully over wooden chairs. The truth was colder, harsher, unforgiving. We're talking about Scandinavia between the 8th and 11th centuries. A time when winter wasn't just a season, but a siege. When the sun would barely peek over the horizon, offering only a few pale hours of grey light, before surrendering again to the endless night. When temperatures could plummet to 20, 30, or even 40 degrees below zero. This was a world where survival meant understanding something that most of us have forgotten. That warmth isn't a right, it's a privilege earned through preparation, community, and an almost stubborn refusal to let the cold win. Tonight, we're going to explore how the Norse people, the Vikings as we've come to call them, managed to not just survive these brutal winters, but to build a culture that thrived in conditions that would break most of us within days. We're going to understand the winter survival skill that made life possible when everything around you wanted you dead. You probably wouldn't last a single night. And I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because understanding just how impossible their lives were makes what they accomplished all the more extraordinary. So let's drift back through the centuries. Back to a time when your breath froze in the air before it could even leave your lungs. Back to the longhouses of Scandinavia, where families huddled together against a darkness that seemed to have no end. The year is around 950 CE. You're somewhere in what we now call Norway, though they wouldn't have called it that. You're in a valley surrounded by mountains that trap the cold air like a bowl holds water. The snow outside is waist deep. It's been falling for 3 days straight, and there's no sign of it stopping. Inside the longhouse, the air is thick, not warm exactly, never warm, but less cold, survivably cold. The kind of cold that lets you keep your fingers and toes if you're careful. If you're smart, if you understand what needs to be done. This is where our story begins. This is where we'll spend the next few hours together, exploring not just how they survived, but why survival mattered so deeply. Because in that cold, in that darkness, something remarkable happened. The very harshness that threatened to destroy them ended up revealing what was most human, most beautiful, most worthy of remembering. orchestrated longhouse scene development within expansive screenplay framework. You're lying very still now. Not because you want to, but because moving means letting cold air slip between the layers of fur and wool that cocoon your body. Your eyes are open in the darkness, though it makes no difference. Open or closed, you see the same absolute black. But you can feel everything. The longhouse breathes around you. That's the first thing you need to understand. This isn't just a building. It's a living thing, and you're inside it, part of its digestive system, part of its circulation, part of the organism that keeps 50, 60, maybe 70 human and animal lives from freezing solid. Beneath you, the sleeping bench is hard. Not wood hard, because there are layers between you and the timber. First, the rushes dried grass harvested in late summer, when the world was still warm, when warmth was something you took for granted. Then, sheepskins wool side up, creating tiny air pockets that trap the heat your body produces. Then your own furs, the ones you pulled over yourself hours ago when darkness fell like a curtain, sudden and complete. But even through all these layers, you can feel the bench itself, feel the solid reality of hewn timber that some ancestor cut and shaped and fitted into place. This bench has held sleeping bodies for decades, maybe longer. The wood remembers. It's smooth where countless bodies have lain worn into gentle curves that almost match the human form. Above you, invisible in the darkness, the roof exhales. You can hear it. A soft, continuous whisper as smoke from the fire finds its way through gaps in the turf, through cracks between wooden shingles, up and out into the night. The smoke moves like blood through veins, carrying away the breath of the fire, the breath of animals, the breath of humans, all that used air, all that moisture, all that evidence of life. And the roof inhales too, though you wouldn't think of it that way. Cold air seeps in, not much, just enough. Through the smoke hole, yes, but also through 1,000 tiny gaps that no amount of moss stuffing can completely seal. The house needs to breathe. Too tight, and the smoke would suffocate you all. Too loose, and the cold would kill you. Somewhere between those extremes is survival, and whoever built this longhouse understood that balance in their bones. The walls pulse with cold. You can't see them, but you know they're there just beyond the sleeping platforms, just beyond the edge of warmth. They're made of vertical posts, oak probably driven deep into the earth. Between the posts, horizontal planks fitted as tight as skill allows. And beyond that, packed against the wood, a layer of turf. Earth and grass roots frozen now into something harder than stone. This turf is working even as you lie here. It's insulation, yes, but it's more than that. In summer, grass grows on it. Roots bind it together. Flowers bloom up there, making the longhouse look like a hill, like part of the landscape, rather than an intrusion on it. But now, in deep winter, the turf is frozen solid, and that frozen layer actually helps. Ice paradoxically insulates. The colder it gets outside, the thicker that frozen layer becomes, the more protection it provides. Between the outer turf and the inner wood, there's a gap. Just a few inches filled with dried moss, with old wool too worn to weave with anything that will trap air. Air is the secret. Still, air doesn't conduct heat well. It sits there dormant, creating a barrier. The Vikings didn't understand thermodynamics, didn't have words like conduction and convection, but they understood this. Keep the air still, and you keep the warmth in. You shift slightly, trying to find a position that doesn't make your hip ache. And immediately you're aware of the person next to you. Your younger brother, maybe 10 years old. You can feel his warmth through the furs, feel him pressed against your back. On his other side, your sister, younger still. And beyond her, your mother. And beyond her, your father. And further down the bench, grandparents, an unmarried aunt, the family arranged like a living chain, each link warming the others. This isn't comfortable. You want to be clear about that. Your shoulder is numb from lying on it. Your hip aches where bone presses against the hard bench. Your nose is cold, the only part of you exposed to the air, and it hurts with a sharp, biting pain that never quite goes away. You need to urinate, have needed to for an hour, but getting up means exposing yourself to the full cold of the house interior, means disturbing everyone around you, means possibly waking the baby who finally mercifully stopped crying an hour ago. So you lie still. You endure. This is what winter is. Down the center of the longhouse, perhaps 15 feet from where you lie, the fire is doing its work. You can't see it, but you can sense it. The faintest red glow, barely enough to register coals buried under ash. Those coals are the heart of the house, the thing everything else depends on. As long as those coals stay alive, as long as that ember of heat persists, the house lives. Let them die, and the house dies with them. The fire breathes too. A soft crackle every few minutes, as a coal splits, as a pocket of sap ignites, as the complex chemistry of combustion continues even in this diminished state. Occasionally, a small flame appears, fed by some stirring of air, some shift in the ash covering. It flickers for a moment, illuminates nothing, and dies. But it's enough. That brief flame, that tiny release of energy, that's life fighting back against the cold. Smoke rises from the fire, always rising, pulled by physics you don't have names for, but understand perfectly. Hot air rises because it's lighter than cold air. The smoke carries that heat upward, warming the upper portion of the house before escaping through the roof. This smoke, you can taste it even in sleep. It coats your throat, makes your eyes water when they're open, leaves a film on everything. But it's also killing the pests that would otherwise infest the thatch. It's preserving the meat hanging from the rafters. It's part of the house's immune system, destroying what would destroy you. From the far end of the longhouse, perhaps 40 feet away, you hear the stamp and shuffle of the cow. She's restless tonight, uncomfortable in her confinement. You can hear her breathing. Great whuffing breaths smell her, even from here, that familiar animal smell of manure and hay and warm hide. She's producing heat, that cow. Not as much as the fire, but enough to matter. Enough that the air at her end of the house is several degrees warmer than it would be otherwise. There are sheep too, 3 of them huddled together in the animal section. You can hear the occasional bleat, soft and questioning, one sheep checking on the others. These animals are wealth. The cow for milk, though her production is way down in winter. The sheep for wool, though they won't be sheared for months yet. And all of them for meat, potentially, if the winter gets desperate enough. But you don't think about that. Can't afford to think about that. The thatch above the animals is darker than the rest of the roof. Years of their breath, their body heat rising, has stained it, made it damp, and then dry, and then damp again in cycles. There's probably rot up there, places where the organic material is breaking down, creating weak spots. In spring, that section will need attention. But spring is a lifetime away. Right now, all that matters is that the roof stays up, keeps the snow out, maintains the envelope of survivable air. Your hearing sharpens in the darkness. Without sight, your other senses reach out, trying to map the space, trying to maintain awareness of your environment, even though there's nothing you can do about anything that might go wrong. You can hear your father's breathing slow and deep. He's actually asleep, one of the few who can truly sleep through winter nights. The work he does during the day, the wood cutting, the repairs, the constant physical labor of maintaining the farm, it exhausts him in a way that overcomes even cold and discomfort. Your mother's breathing is different, lighter, more irregular. She's not really asleep. She's in that state between waking and sleeping, that suspended animation where you're aware but not quite present. She's listening to the baby, to the toddler, to the fire, to the house itself. Mothers don't sleep deeply in winter, can't afford to. Your grandmother coughs a wet, rattling sound that makes you wince. She's been coughing like that all winter, and everyone knows what it means. The smoke years of breathing this smoke-filled air has done something to her lungs. She'll probably make it to spring. Probably, but maybe not. Winter takes the old ones, takes them quietly, takes them in their sleep if they're lucky. The house creaks, loud and sudden, a crack like breaking ice, and you feel yourself tense even though you know what it is. The timbers contracting as they freeze. Wood shrinks in cold, and when it shrinks, it makes noise. The whole structure is settling, adjusting, responding to the temperature. These sounds used to frighten you when you were small. Now they're just part of the night's texture, no more alarming than breathing. But there are other sounds that do alarm you. The wind, for instance, which has been building for the last hour. It's not just wind. It's a living thing, a predator prowling around the longhouse, testing every joint, every gap, every weakness. It finds the door and pushes against it, making the heavy timber rattle in its frame. It finds a crack in the wall somewhere up high, and it whistles through it a thin high note that speaks of the vast cold outside. The snow hitting the walls makes a different sound, a soft, continuous susurrus, like whispered secrets. The storm which started at dusk is getting worse. You know this without seeing it. You can hear the accumulation, the weight of snow building on the roof pressing down. Too much, and the roof could collapse. It's happened before in other winters to other families. But your father built this roof strong, and it's held through 20 winters. It'll hold through this one. Between the sleeping people, between the sounds of animals and wind and house, there are smaller sounds. The baby sucking on its fist in sleep. Your brother grinding his teeth, a habit he has. The dog curled up somewhere near the fire, scratching at fleas, the scratch, 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 rhythmic and persistent. These small sounds, these signs of individual life, they're oddly comforting. They mean everyone's still here, still alive, still surviving. You become aware of your body's discomfort in stages. First, the hip, which you've already noticed. Then your arm, which has gone completely numb because you've been lying on it. You try to move it just slightly, just enough to restore circulation. But moving means disturbing the careful arrangement of furs, means letting cold air into the warm pocket you've created, means potentially waking the people pressed against you. So you move slowly, incrementally, shifting your weight 1 degree at a time. Your brother mutters something in his sleep and presses closer, seeking the warmth you're momentarily disrupting. Your sister's breathing changes pitch, suggesting she's near waking, but then it settles again. Crisis averted. Your arm comes back to life with painful pins and needles, blood returning to oxygen-starved tissue. You want to shake it, want to accelerate the process, but you don't. You just lie there and endure the sensation, knowing it will pass, knowing that this discomfort is nothing compared to the cold that waits outside. The darkness presses down. It's not just absence of light. It has weight, has presence, has texture. You could reach out your hand, wave it in front of your face, and see absolutely nothing. This darkness is what blindness must be, like you think. This is what it means to navigate entirely by sound and touch and smell and memory. But you're not afraid of the darkness. You've never known anything else. Electric lights don't exist. Even candles and oil lamps are too precious to burn through the night. Darkness is normal. Darkness is what night means. Your eyes are adapted to it in ways that your descendants 1,000 years from now will never experience. In the faintest light, the barest suggestion of flame you can navigate can see shapes and forms that modern eyes would miss entirely. The house continues its work around you. The turf walls breathing, the smoke escaping, the timbers holding, the fire maintaining its ember heart, the animals producing their slow warmth, all of it working together, a complex system that keeps the cold at bay, that maintains this pocket of survivable temperature in a world that wants you dead. You think about the cold outside. You don't want to, but you can't help it. Out there, beyond these walls, the cold is absolute. -20, -30, maybe colder. Cold enough that spit would freeze before hitting the ground. Cold enough that exposed skin would develop frostbite in minutes. Cold enough that the very air could kill you, freezing your lungs from the inside. But in here, it's maybe 40 degrees Fahrenheit. 45 if you're near the fire. Not warm, not even close to warm, but survivable. Your body can maintain its core temperature at 45 degrees, especially when you're buried under furs pressed against other warm bodies. This is the margin between life and death. 7 or 8 degrees difference between the air in here and the air out there. That's all. That's everything. Above you, hanging from the rafters, meat is curing. You can't see it, but you know it's there. Fish cut into strips and dried. A ham what's left of the pigs slaughtered in autumn. These hang in the smoke, slowly drying, slowly being preserved. They're part of the house's circulation too, part of the system. The smoke rises, preserves the meat hangs, and waits ready to feed you when supplies run lower. This is the machine you live inside. Not a machine of gears and levers, but a biological machine, an organic machine, a machine made of wood and earth and smoke and breath, and the accumulated wisdom of generations who figured out through trial and error, through death and survival, how to make this work. Your role in the machine right now is simple. Lie still. Generate heat. Don't waste energy. Sleep if you can, but even rest serves a purpose. Your body at rest is more efficient, produces more warmth relative to the calories burned. Every breath you take adds moisture and warmth to the air. Every beat of your heart pumps warm blood through your extremities, keeps your fingers and toes alive, keeps frostbite from claiming them. You are not just in the house. You are part of it. You and your family and the animals and the fire, all of you components of a larger organism whose sole purpose is survival. To maintain life through winter, to reach spring, to continue the cycle. And lying here in the darkness pressed against your brother, listening to the wind, feeling the house breathe around you, you understand something profound that you have no words for. You understand that you are not separate from this place, not a visitor or an occupant. You are interwoven with it, dependent on it, part of its living structure, as surely as the smoke or the walls or the fire. The house keeps you alive, but you keep the house alive too. Without human attention, without someone tending the fire, without someone checking for drafts and repairing damage and managing resources, the house would die. The fire would go out. The cold would win. So you continue to lie there very still, doing your part in the great work of surviving. And somehow, despite the discomfort, despite the cold nose, an aching hip, and the urgent need to urinate, you begin to drift. Not quite sleep, but something close. That suspended state where your mind wanders, where time loses meaning, where you exist in a kind of timeless now that might last 5 minutes or 5 hours. The house breathes. You breathe. The fire breathes. Together you survive another hour of darkness, another hour closer to dawn, another small victory against the cold. In this profound silence, you realize that patience itself is a cultivated winter survival skill. It is a discipline of the mind, a refusal to let the anxiety of the long night consume your energy or quicken your pulse. You breathe slowly, deliberately mastering the internal winter survival skill that keeps panic at bay, turning your stillness into a shield against the freezing void outside. This isn't just passive waiting. It is the ultimate winter survival skill. The quiet, steadfast belief that no matter how deep the shadow falls, you possess the endurance to outlast it. You remember the evening you first saw the fear in a child's eyes when they understood what the fire meant. It was your brother, the one pressed against your back right now. He was 10, then old enough to be useful, old enough to be taught, but still young enough to be frightened of responsibility this heavy. You had been 13 already, a veteran of winter nights, already trusted with tasks that mattered. You remember your father's hand on your brother's shoulder, heavy and certain the way important moments began in your family. No ceremony, no announcement, just that hand settling with the weight of tradition. Tonight, your father had said, "You watch the fire," and in your brother's face, you saw what you must have looked like 3 years earlier when those same words were spoken to you. Terror and pride fighting each other. The understanding that childhood, whatever that meant in this cold place, was ending. That from this night forward, people's lives would depend on whether you stayed awake, whether you paid attention, whether you understood what the coals were telling you. You're lying there now, years later, but you remember that night as if it's happening again. Remember watching your brother sit beside the fire pit as evening fell, his small body rigid with determination, his hands clasped together to keep them from trembling. The preparation for night had begun the same as always, but everything felt different because of the weight of what was about to happen. Your mother had prepared the evening meal barley porridge with dried fish, the smell of it cutting through the ever-present smoke. The family ate in silence or near silence because everyone understood that tonight was important, that the boy needed to focus, needed to gather his courage. The fire at that moment was still strong, still producing real heat and light. Wood had been added through the afternoon, building up that reserve of coals, creating the heat mass that would have to last through the coldest hours. But as full darkness came, As the family began to settle onto the sleeping benches, your father stopped adding wood. This was deliberate. This was the beginning of the test. You had settled onto the bench where you lie now, watching through half-closed eyes, pretending to sleep, but completely awake, completely focused on what was happening at the fire. Your brother sat cross-legged beside the hearth, the fire steel and flint within reach, though he wouldn't need them. Wouldn't need them if he did his job right. Beside him was a small pile of wood carefully selected. The pieces were no bigger than your forearm split to expose dry heartwood chosen for their ability to burn slowly and steadily without producing too much flame. The fire began its decline. The flames diminished, sank into the coal bed, became just the memory of flames, just heat, and the faintest red glow. You could see your brother leaning forward, peering into that glow, trying to read what he was seeing, trying to remember everything your father had taught him over the past weeks. Watch the color, your father had told him. Deep red means good heat. When you see orange appearing, when the red starts to fade toward gray, that's when you know it's getting dangerous. That's when you add wood. But there was more to it than that. There was the question of how much wood. Too much. And you'd waste it, burn through your supply too quickly. Risk running out before winter ended. Too little, and the coals might die, might fade to ash. And then you'd be relighting from scratch in the cold and dark, a process that could take an hour, that could fail, that could mean everyone waking to a house gone cold to the real possibility of freezing. Hours passed. The family slept or pretended to sleep. You lay there, your eyes adjusted to the darkness, watching the small silhouette of your brother against the faint glow of coals. He didn't move much. Occasionally, he'd lean forward to look more closely at the fire. Once, he reached out his hand, holding it above the coals, testing the heat the way your father had shown him. The cold deepened. You could feel it even through the firs, the way it pressed in as the night advanced, as the fire diminished. The house cooled degree by degree, approaching that equilibrium point where the heat generated by the fire and bodies and animals balanced against the heat lost to the outside. In summer, this balance point was comfortable. In deep winter, it was barely survivable. You saw the moment when your brother made his decision. You saw him reach for a piece of wood, saw him hesitate, saw him pull his hand back. Not yet. The coals were still good, still red enough, still producing enough heat. Adding wood now would be wasteful. He was learning already. Learning the discipline of restraint, the knowledge that winter is long and resources are finite. More time passed. How much? An hour. Time moved strangely in the darkness, stretched or compressed depending on whether you were paying attention or drifting. But you stayed awake, stayed vigilant, ready to intervene if necessary. If your brother failed, if the fire threatened to die. Then you saw him move again. This time there was no hesitation. He reached for a piece of wood, a single piece, and he placed it carefully onto the coals. Not thrown, not dropped, placed, positioned so that it had good contact with the hottest coals, so that it would catch quickly, but not so buried that it would smother, that it would prevent air from reaching the combustion zone. For a long moment, nothing happened. The wood sat there dark against the red glow. Your brother didn't move. He was waiting, watching, holding his breath perhaps. And then, slowly, you saw the change. The wood began to smoke. small wisps at first, then more substantial. And then finally, a small flame appeared, licked up the side of the wood, found purchase began to grow. Your brother sat back slightly, and even in the darkness you could sense his relief. The wood was catching. The fire was accepting his offering. The coals would stay alive. But the work wasn't done. Over the next hour, your brother added 2 more pieces of wood, spacing them, carefully maintaining the fire at that perfect level where it produced enough heat to matter, but not so much that it consumed fuel too quickly. Each time he moved, you watched. Each time he made a decision, you evaluated it. And each time he did it right. The coldest part of the night came perhaps 2 hours before dawn. This is always the worst time, the time when body temperature is naturally lowest, when even healthy people feel most vulnerable, when the old and the sick are most likely to die. The fire had burned down again, down to coals, and you saw your brother lean forward, checking them, making sure they were still alive. He added wood, 2 pieces this time, recognizing somehow that dawn was approaching, that it was time to start building the fire back up, to start generating the heat that would be needed for morning, for people to wake into, for the new day to begin in something approaching comfort. And then, when the wood had caught, when the flames were established, you saw him do something that made your chest tighten. He arranged the ash carefully over part of the coal bed, covering the coals that didn't have wood on them, preserving them, insulating them, making sure that even if something went wrong, even if the wood didn't burn as expected, there would still be coals alive underneath the ash. This was advanced technique. This was something your father had shown him only once, casually, not emphasizing it, just demonstrating it as part of the general knowledge of fire tending. And your brother had remembered, had understood its importance, was applying it now in the coldest part of the night when it mattered most. The house began to warm slightly as the fire grew. You could feel it, the change in air temperature, the way the cold loosened its grip just slightly. Around you, people stirred in their sleep, responding unconsciously to the increase in warmth, settling deeper into rest, now that the crisis point of the night had passed. Your brother sat by the fire, and in its growing light, you could see his face. He looked tired. His eyes were heavy, his shoulders slumped. But there was something else in his expression too, something that hadn't been there before tonight. Pride, perhaps, or more accurately, the absence of doubt. He had done it. He had kept the fire alive. He had kept the family safe. As dawn approached, as the darkness began to thin just slightly, just enough that you could start to see shapes and forms, your brother added more wood. The fire grew stronger. Light and heat filled the house, chasing away the deepest cold, making morning possible. Your father was the first to wake, or more accurately, the first to admit he was awake, because you suspected he'd been watching the whole time too, just as you had been. He sat up, stretched and looked at the fire, looked at your brother sitting beside it, looked at the woodpile, evaluating how much had been used. He said nothing, just nodded once, a single sharp dip of his chin. But that nod meant everything. It meant you did well. It meant I trust you now. It meant welcome to the community of people who keep us alive. Your brother tried to nod back, tried to mirror that adult gesture, but what came out was more of a collapse. His body folded forward, exhaustion claiming him, now that the responsibility had been discharged. Your mother moved quickly, gathering him up, pulling him onto the sleeping bench, covering him with furs. He was asleep before he was fully horizontal. The sleep of the truly exhausted, the sleep of someone who had earned rest. But the fire burned on. The fire your brother had kept alive. The fire that now became part of his identity, part of his place in the family structure. From that night forward, he was one of the fire watchers, one of the people trusted with the most essential task. No longer a child, even though he was still young. No longer dependent, even though he still needed care. You're lying there now, years later, and you can feel him pressed against your back, grown bigger, grown stronger, but still the same person who sat terrified and determined beside that fire. And you know, with absolute certainty, that if something happened to you, if you were sick or injured or absent, he could keep the fire alive. He has that skill now, that knowledge, that responsibility woven into his bones. This is how knowledge survives in your world. Not written down, not recorded in books that will be read centuries later, but passed from hand to hand, from watching to doing, from fear to competence to expertise. Your father learned from his father. You learned from your father. Your brother learned from watching you and your father. And someday he'll teach his own children, and the chain will continue stretching back into the unmeasured past and forward into an unknowable future. The fire is never just fire. It's memory. It's tradition. It's the accumulated wisdom of everyone who ever learned how to keep one alive through a winter night. Every piece of wood your brother added that night, he added with the knowledge of generations behind him, guiding his hands, informing his choices. And the weight of that knowledge, that responsibility, it wasn't crushing. It was exactly the size of a child's hands. Exactly the weight of a single piece of wood, carefully chosen, carefully placed. The Vikings understood. This understood that you don't teach children by overwhelming them, but by giving them tasks that are just at the edge of their capability, tasks that require them to stretch, to grow, to become more than they were. Your brother proved something that night, not to your father who already believed in him, not to the family who would have loved him regardless, but to himself. He proved that he could be trusted with life, that he could carry the weight of other people's survival, that he was worthy of the knowledge that had been passed to him. And now, lying here in the darkness, you carry your own memories of that moment when the responsibility was given to you. You remember your own night beside the fire. You remember your own fear and your own determination. You remember the moment when dawn came and you realized you'd done it. You'd kept everyone alive, and that feeling, that mix of exhaustion and pride and relief, it's something you'll carry forever. This is what it means to be human in this time and place. It means being woven into a web of mutual dependence, of shared knowledge, of responsibilities that pass from generation to generation. The fire is the symbol of all of it. Keep the fire alive, and you keep the family alive. Let the fire die, and everything dies with it. Outside, the storm continues. The wind howls, the snow falls. The cold presses against the walls with patient malevolence. But inside, the fire burns. The fire that your brother kept alive on his first night of responsibility. The fire that has burned in some form for as long as your people have existed. The fire that will burn tomorrow and the day after, and through all the winters to come, as long as there are hands to tend it, as long as there are people willing to sit awake in the cold darkness, making sure the coals don't die. And now you lie here again, years after that night, listening to your brother breathe in sleep against your back. The rhythm is different than it was when he was 10. Deeper, slower, the breath of someone whose body has grown, whose chest has broadened, whose lungs have expanded with years of breathing this smoke-filled air. But in your mind, he's still that small boy sitting rigid beside the fire, his hands clasped to keep them from trembling, his eyes wide with the weight of what he'd been trusted with. That image is layered over this present moment, over the warmth you feel from his sleeping body, over the familiar sound of his breathing. Time moves strangely in winter darkness. Past and present exist simultaneously, separated only by the thinnest membrane of memory. You wonder if he remembers that night the way you do, if he carries the same images, the same sensations, the fear, the determination, the moment when the first piece of wood caught, when the flames licked up and confirmed that yes, he had done it right, the fire accepted his offering. That moment when childhood ended, not with ceremony or announcement, but with the simple act of placing wood on coals and watching it burn. Above you, invisible in the darkness, smoke continues its eternal work, rising from coals that your brother, or perhaps your father, or perhaps you yourself, tended hours ago before sleep claimed you all. The fire burns lower now, but it still lives. Someone will wake in a few hours, will check. It will add wood if needed. The cycle continues. The chain remains unbroken. You shift slightly, trying to find a position that doesn't make your shoulder ache quite so much. And as you move, your brother mutters something in his sleep. Not words, just a sound, a syllable that means nothing and everything. He's dreaming, perhaps, of what? Of summer, maybe, when the world is warm and green. Of sailing, which he's talked about, which young men always talk about. Of adventure beyond these walls, beyond this valley, beyond the endless cycle of summer preparation and winter survival. But tonight, in this moment, in this darkness, adventure is somewhere else. Tonight, there is only the breathing house, the sleeping family, the patient fire and the cold that presses against everything. Testing, always testing. Looking for weakness, for failure, for any gap in the armor of knowledge and preparation that keeps you all alive. Time moves differently in this darkness, loses its usual forward momentum, becomes something else. Now that you're settled, now that the preparations are done, and the darkness has fully descended, we can talk about what the night actually feels like. Not just physically, though, that's part of it, but psychologically, emotionally, what it does to the human mind to be trapped in darkness and cold for 15, 16 hours at a stretch. Because here's the thing that's hard to communicate to someone who's never experienced it. Time moves differently in this kind of darkness. Without any visual cues, without the ability to see the passage of night through changing shadows or moonlight, every hour feels the same. The night becomes a uniform block of darkness stretched out and seemingly endless. You lie there under your pile of furs and you can't see anything, literally nothing. Your eyes are open, you're awake, but the darkness is so complete that it makes no difference whether your eyes are open or closed. This isn't the comfortable darkness of a modern bedroom where your eyes adjust and you can start to make out shapes. This is absolute darkness. The kind of darkness that primitive parts of your brain interpret as danger. Your hearing becomes hyper-aware. Every sound is magnified. You can hear your own heartbeat, your own breathing. You can hear the person next to you breathing. You can identify who's who by the sound of their breath. The children with their quick, shallow breaths. The old man at the end with his wheezing, rattling chest. The woman with a cold who keeps coughing, trying to muffle it in the furs. The house speaks too. All houses make noises, but you're not used to these sounds. That crack, sudden and sharp like a gunshot, that's a timber in the roof contracting as it freezes. That creaking long and drawn out, that's the walls settling under the weight of snow on the roof. That scrabbling sound that's probably just a mouse in the thatch. Probably. You tell yourself it's just a mouse. Outside, the wind is constant. Sometimes it's just a steady moan air moving past the house, finding every tiny gap. Sometimes it rises to a howl, shaking the door in its frame, rattling the roof. And when the wind carries snow, you can hear it hitting the walls, a soft susurrus like whispers, like the house is being buried alive, which, in a way, it is. The cold is a presence. It's hard to explain if you haven't felt it, but cold like this isn't just the absence of heat. It's an active force. It presses against the walls. It seeps through the smallest cracks. It rises up from the floor and down from the ceiling. You can feel it on your face, which is the only part of you that's exposed. Your nose gets so cold that it hurts. Your cheeks go numb. You pull the furs up higher, trying to create a little pocket of warmer air around your face, but then you're breathing your own exhalation moisture that will freeze on the furs. And besides, your instinct is to breathe fresh air, even if that air is cold enough to sear your lungs. Time stretches. An hour feels like 3. You're tired, exhausted even, but true deep sleep is elusive. You drift in and out. Sometimes you're not even sure if you're awake or asleep. The border between the two becomes blurry. You might dream you're walking through snow, climbing a mountain. And then you wake up, or realize you were awake all along, and you're just remembering last winter, or the winter before, that all the winters blurring together into one long season of cold and dark. There's a phenomenon that happens in these conditions, something that historians and psychologists have documented in other contexts of extreme isolation and darkness. Your mind starts to wander. Not just daydream, but really wander. You think about summers. You remember what warmth feels like, what sunshine feels like. The memories are so vivid that for a moment you can almost feel it, that warmth on your skin. And then the feeling fades, and you're back in the cold and the darkness, and it's almost worse, that contrast. Some people, particularly children, are afraid of the dark. That's natural. But the adults are afraid of something else, something more specific. They're afraid of the fire going out. Because if the fire dies completely, if those coals go cold, you're in serious trouble. Relighting a fire from scratch in these conditions is difficult. Not impossible, but difficult. You'd need to use a fire steel and strike sparks into a bundle of very dry tinder, and your hands would be clumsy with cold, and it might take many attempts. So there's always someone who's designated to check the fire. Maybe once in the middle of the night, maybe twice if it's particularly cold. This person has the worst job in some ways. They have to leave the warmth of the furs, expose themselves to the full cold of the house interior, and make their way in complete darkness to where the fire should be. They move by touch and memory. The house is familiar enough that they know the layout by heart. So many steps from the sleeping bench to the hearth. Mind the support post on the left. Don't trip over the spinning wheel that's left near the fire. Their hands extended in front of them find the edge of the hearth. They kneel down carefully and reach into the ash. The ash is still warm, beautifully warm compared to everything else. and they can feel the coals underneath. They might add a small piece of wood, just a single piece, carefully placed. They might simply rearrange the coals slightly, making sure they're concentrated, making sure they're getting enough air, but not too much. Then they make their way back, their hands now, black with ash and charcoal, and they burrow back under the furs and press against whoever's next to them, stealing back some of the body heat they lost during their brief excursion. Their nose is running from the cold. Their eyes are watering. But the fire is okay. The fire will last till morning. That knowledge lets them relax, lets them drift back toward something approaching sleep. And the night continues, hour after hour. The darkness doesn't lessen. The cold doesn't relent. You exist in a kind of suspended state, not really awake, but not really asleep, just enduring, just waiting for the first sign that morning might be approaching. That sign, when it finally comes, is subtle. It's not light. Not yet. It's more a slight lessening of the darkness, a sense that the quality of the black has changed somehow. It's still dark, too dark to see anything, but something deep in your brain recognizes the dawn is approaching. People start to stir, not all at once. First one person, then another. Maybe the fire tender gets up again to properly restart the fire, adding real wood now, enough to generate actual heat and light. The first flames are like a miracle. After hours and hours of darkness, even that small flickering light is enough to make you blink to squint. As the fire builds, the interior of the longhouse slowly becomes visible. You can see the people around you, now huddled shapes under piles of furs. You can see your own breath, great clouds of condensation that catch the firelight. You can see the frost that's formed on the underside of the roof, sparkles of ice that will melt and drip as the house warms up. Outside, if you cracked open the door and looked out, you'd see a world transformed. Everything is white. Snow has continued falling through the night, and it's piled up against the door. The familiar landscape, the outbuildings, the fences, everything is softened and rounded by snow. The light is grey dim, the sun not yet visible, even though technically it's risen. In the deepest part of winter, the sun might just barely clear the horizon before starting its descent again. But you're alive. You made it through another night. Your family made it through. You all emerge from your furs like animals from hibernation, stiff and cold, and needing to move, needing to warm up. The first order of business is getting the fire properly established, getting real warmth back into the house, getting water heated for a morning drink of something hot. The animals, if they're inside, need to be tended to. They need to be let out to relieve themselves. And yes, even in this cold, even in this snow, they need to go out. They'll come right back in, trust me. They know where the warmth is. People stretch. They move around. They talk their voices rough from disuse, from breathing cold, dry air all night. Someone makes a joke, probably a dark one, about the cold or the snow or how long this winter seems to be lasting. There's laughter. Tired laughter, but real. Because this is the morning ritual. This is the reassertion of life. You made it. You're here. Today is another day, another chance to work, to prepare, to make sure you'll make it through the next night, and the one after that, and all the nights until spring finally mercifully arrives. This was the rhythm of Viking winter life. Night after night after night, each one a small battle against the elements, each morning a small victory. They didn't just endure this, they integrated it into their culture, their worldview. They developed strategies, both practical and psychological, to not just survive, but to maintain their sanity, their social bonds, and their sense of self. And that's what we're going to explore in the next parts of our journey together. Because survival wasn't just about fire and furs, and keeping your body temperature above freezing. It was about keeping your mind occupied. It was about maintaining social cohesion. It was about having reasons to endure reasons, to believe that spring would come and life would continue. So stay with me. We're going deeper now into the stories they told, the games they played, and the ways they made meaning out of this cold existence. Let me tell you something that makes Viking winter survival even more remarkable. They were relatively new to these northern latitudes. The ancestors of the Vikings, the Germanic peoples of Scandinavia, had been gradually moving northward for centuries. But the classic Viking Age, the period we're discussing, represents a culture that was still actively adapting to some of the harshest winters on the planet. Think about that. These weren't people who had evolved over tens of thousands of years in this environment, like the Sami people who had been in the far north since time immemorial. The Norse were still learning, still developing their winter survival skill techniques, still figuring out what worked and what didn't. And they were doing this while also building ships that could cross oceans, while raiding and trading across half of Europe, while establishing settlements from Dublin to Constantinople. The archaeological record gives us glimpses into how this adaptation happened. Sites like Birka in Sweden, like Kaupang in Norway, like the Oseberg ship burial, they all tell pieces of the story. But one of the most illuminating examples comes from Iceland, and it's a story about food power and what happens when the environment pushes back against human ambition. Iceland was settled beginning in the late 800s CE, primarily by Norwegian chieftains and their followers, who were either fleeing the consolidation of royal power in Norway or seeking new opportunities. These settlers brought with them their entire agricultural system, their animals, their techniques, everything that had worked on the Norwegian coast. And at first, it seemed to work. Iceland, despite being further north than Norway, has a relatively mild coastal climate thanks to the Gulf Stream. The first generations of settlers found a land covered in birch forest with good grass for grazing. They built their longhouses, established their farms, brought in cattle and sheep and horses. Now, here's where the story gets interesting from a historical and ecological perspective. Dr. Davide Zori's work at the Hrisbru site, which I mentioned earlier, uncovered something fascinating in the animal remains from feasting deposits. By analyzing the bones from different time periods at this one farm, his team could track a change in what animals were being slaughtered for important communal feasts. In the early period of settlement, roughly the late 800s through the mid-900s, the dominant animal at feasts was cattle, beef. Now this is significant because cattle are what's called a high-status animal. They require lots of grazing land they need to be fed through the winter, and they're valuable alive for milk and as breeding stock. To slaughter a cow for a feast to provide beef for your neighbors and followers, that's a display of wealth and power. But as time went on, something changed. By the late 900s and into the 1000s, the animal remains show a shift. Less beef, more mutton and goat, sheep and goats replacing cattle. On the surface, this might not seem like a big deal, different meat. So what? But to an archaeologist studying power structures, this shift is huge, because what it represents is environmental pressure forcing social change. What happened was, this Iceland's thin soils, especially in the interior, couldn't sustain intensive grazing. The birch forests were being cut down for timber and fuel. Erosion started to become a serious problem. And cattle, wonderful as they are, have particular requirements. They need good grass, lots of it. As the environment degraded, as the easy resources were used, upkeeping large herds of cattle became increasingly difficult. Sheep and goats, on the other hand, are much hardier. They can survive on poorer grazing land. They can make do with less. But they're also lower status. Everyone can afford sheep. Slaughtering a sheep for a feast doesn't carry the same weight, doesn't make the same statement about your power and prosperity. So, what we're seeing in this shift is the erosion, literally and figuratively, of the old power structures that the settlers brought with them from Norway. The chieftains, who based their authority on displays of lavish hospitality, on their ability to slaughter cattle and feed the community beef, they found that system unsustainable in Iceland's harsher environment. This connects directly to winter survival, because winter was when these power structures were reinforced and tested. Winter was feast season. Summer was for working for the endless toil of making hay and preparing for the cold months. But winter, when work was limited, was when the community gathered in the chieftain's hall. This was when you were supposed to be generous to display your wealth through food and drink and warm hospitality. A chieftain who couldn't provide, who had to make do with lesser provisions, who ran out of supplies before spring, that chieftain's authority was damaged. People might choose to follow someone else the next year. They might move to a different farm pledge, themselves to a different leader. So these winter feasts, they weren't just social gatherings, they were political theatre. They were demonstrations of who had successfully managed their resources through the summer and autumn, who had stored enough to not just survive, but to be generous. And as the environment changed, as the old playbook stopped working, the society had to adapt. Now let's shift our perspective for a moment and think about winter survival in a completely different context. One that many of you might find surprising: the American frontier. Abraham Lincoln, before he was president, before he was a lawyer, before he was anything that history would remember, was a child of the frontier in southern Indiana. And the winters there, while not as extreme as Scandinavia, were brutal in their own way. The Lincoln family, like many settlers, lived in conditions that would have been familiar to a Viking. Their cabin was small, maybe 14 feet by 18 feet, with a dirt floor and no windows. In the winter of 1818, when Abraham was 9 years old, his mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, died of what was called milk sickness. This was a form of poisoning caused by drinking the milk of cows that had eaten white snake root, a plant that contains a toxic alcohol called trematol. Milk sickness was a scourge of the frontier. People didn't understand what caused it. One day, you'd be fine, the next, you'd be stricken with weakness, trembling, vomiting. Many people died. Nancy Lincoln was one of them. She was 34 years old. Abraham and his sister Sarah helped their father Thomas build a coffin out of green lumber that was still wet from the tree. They had no choice. There was no time for proper seasoning of wood. Nancy was buried on a hill near the cabin. This event, this death in the cold and the isolation, shaped Lincoln in ways that historians are still trying to fully understand. He became, by all accounts, a melancholy person prone to deep depression. But he also developed a fierce determination to rise above the circumstances of his birth, to become something more than a frontier farmer struggling to survive. The connection between Lincoln and our Viking story isn't just about cold winters and hard living. It's about what humans do when survival is a daily challenge. They adapt, they learn, they find meaning in the struggle itself. Lincoln taught himself to read and write mostly by firelight in that tiny cabin. He borrowed books whenever he could. One of his favorites was a biography of George Washington, which taught him that people could rise from humble origins to greatness. He read the Bible, which gave him a framework for understanding suffering and redemption. He read Shakespeare, which taught him about the complexity of human nature. Just as the Vikings developed games and stories to make it through the long winter nights, Lincoln used books and learning as his way of escaping mentally from the grinding poverty and isolation of frontier life. He was practicing his own form of winter survival skill, maintaining his mental vitality in conditions that could easily have crushed it. There's a story, probably apocryphal, but nonetheless telling that Lincoln once walked 6 miles through snow to return a few cents to a customer he had accidentally overcharged. Whether or not this actually happened, the fact that such stories were told about him speaks to how he was perceived as someone who maintained his integrity, his core values, even when survival might seem to demand shortcuts or compromise. This brings us to an important insight about winter survival in general, across cultures and time periods. The physical challenges are only half the story. Yes, you need shelter, warmth, food, but you also need something else. You need purpose. You need a reason to endure. You need to maintain your sense of who you are, what you value, what makes you human. The Vikings developed elaborate social rituals and cultural practices specifically for winter. They had feast days that punctuated the darkness. They had storytelling traditions that kept history and identity alive across generations. They had games and competitions that let young men prove themselves without the violence of raiding season. Lincoln had his books and his ambition and his developing sense of justice. Later in life, when he was president during another kind of winter, the winter of the Civil War, he would use storytelling and humor in much the same way the Vikings did. He would tell jokes in cabinet meetings to the exasperation of his advisors who thought he should be more serious. But he understood, perhaps from his frontier childhood, that humor and story were how you survived. They were how you maintained your humanity when everything around you was trying to strip it away. Both cultures separated by centuries, and thousands of miles arrived at the same conclusion. Survival isn't just about the body. It's about the mind, the spirit, the social bonds that hold people together when everything else is trying to pull them apart. And this brings us to a final historical observation that ties everything together. Throughout human history, the societies that have thrived in harsh winter climates, from the Norse to the Russian Cossacks, to the Canadian First Nations, to the American frontier settlers, they all developed certain common traits. They developed a sense of humor about their hardships. They had to. You can't be grim and serious all the time when you're living like this. You'll go mad. So you joke about the cold. You make light of the danger. You laugh at shared misery because laughter is a form of resistance against despair. They developed strong communal bonds. Winter survival is rarely an individual achievement. You need your family, your neighbors, your community. You need to know that if your fire goes out, someone will help you relight it. If you run short on food, someone will share. This creates a kind of enforced egalitarianism, a recognition that everyone's survival is linked. They developed respect for preparation and planning. You can't wing it through a 6-month winter. You need to prepare in advance to think ahead to make hard choices about resource allocation. This creates a certain character type, practical, forward thinking, willing to sacrifice present comfort for future security. And they developed deep appreciation for small pleasures, a warm fire, a full belly, a story well told. These aren't taken for granted when you're living on the edge. They're treasured. They're what make life worth living. So when we think about Viking winter survival, or Lincoln's frontier childhood, or any of these historical examples of humans enduring extreme cold, we're not just learning about the past. We're learning about fundamental human capacities for adaptation, resilience, and finding meaning in struggle. The Vikings, who huddled in their longhouses through those endless winter nights, they weren't just surviving. They were building the culture that would eventually spread across half of Europe. They were developing the skills and values and social structures that would make them one of the most influential peoples of the medieval period. Lincoln, reading by firelight in that Indiana cabin, wasn't just trying to stay warm. He was building the intellectual and moral foundation that would eventually make him one of the most important figures in American history. Winter, in these contexts, wasn't just an obstacle to be overcome. It was a forge that shaped individuals and societies in fundamental ways. It tested them. It forced them to develop strength and ingenuity and solidarity. And in some strange way, it made them who they were. Now let's talk about the technologies, the tools and techniques that made Viking winter survival possible. Because this wasn't just about suffering through the cold with gritted teeth. The Norse people were innovators, engineers in their own right, and they developed some remarkably sophisticated solutions to the challenges they faced. Start with clothing. This is where the real winter survival skill shows itself in the careful layering of materials that each served a specific purpose. The base layer against the skin would be linen. You might think wool would make more sense, but linen has a specific advantage. It wicks moisture away from the body. When you're working, when you're generating heat and sweat, you need that moisture moved away from your skin. If it stays, it'll cool through evaporation and actually make you colder. Over the linen goes wool, multiple layers of wool. The Norse were master weavers, and their wool textiles were among the finest in medieval Europe. But here's what's clever. They understood that different weaves and preparations of wool served different functions. For inner layers, you want a softer, finer weave. Something comfortable against the skin, even if you're wearing it over linen. For outer layers, you want something denser, more tightly woven, ideally with the natural lanolin still partially in the wool. Lanolin is the oil that sheep produce, and it makes wool naturally water-resistant. A wool cloak that still contains lanolin will shed light rain and snow. Then there's the question of fur. Archaeological evidence shows that the Norse used a variety of furs, from common animals like sheep and goat to more exotic ones like bear and wolf. But there was also a fascinating technology that's less well known. They used the pelts of marine mammals. Seal skin, for instance, is naturally waterproof. A coat or boots made from seal skin will keep you completely dry. Archaeological finds from Norse Greenland include numerous items made from seal skin. These weren't just practical items. The finest sealskin garments were status symbols, evidence of access to maritime resources and the trade networks that moved such goods. But perhaps the most ingenious material they used was something that sounds almost too strange to be real. They used fish skin, specifically the skins of large fish, like cod or wolffish, which are relatively abundant in Norse waters. These skins, when properly processed, become a material that's flexible, durable, and reasonably water-resistant. They used it for mittens, for patches, for reinforcing worn areas on clothing. Footwear deserves special attention because your feet in contact with the cold ground are one of the first places where frostbite will strike. The Norse developed several types of cold weather boots, but the most effective was probably the type that combined multiple materials. The sole would be thick leather, often reinforced with extra layers or even thin wood. The upper part of the boot would be softer leather or textile fitted relatively tightly to keep snow out. But the crucial element was insulation. Inside the boot, you'd stuff dried grass or wool, creating an air gap between your foot and the boot itself. This air gap is what actually provides insulation. You might also notice I haven't mentioned socks. That's because knitting as we know it wasn't widespread in Scandinavia during the Viking Age. Instead, they used what's called knoll binding, a technique using a single needle that creates a denser, less stretchy fabric than knitting. These foot wraps were functional, but they didn't have the elasticity of modern socks. Now let's talk about fire technology, because this is literally a matter of life and death. The Norse used a fire steel and flint or iron pyrite to create sparks. The fire steel is a C-shaped piece of hardened steel. You strike it against a sharp edge of flint, which shaves off tiny particles of steel. These particles, heated by friction, ignite in the air. They're your sparks. But sparks alone won't create fire. You need tinder, and this is where real skill comes in. The best tinder is material that will catch from a tiny spark and then burn long enough and hot enough to ignite kindling. The Norse used a fungus called touchwood or tinder fungus, which grows on dead birch trees. This fungus, when properly prepared, boiled and pounded, will catch a spark easily. Archaeological evidence shows that people carried small pouches containing this prepared tinder, kept dry and ready for use. Some sources suggest they also used a technique called charcloth, though the evidence for this in Scandinavia is less clear. Charcloth is linen or other plant fiber that's been partially burned in a low-oxygen environment. It becomes carbonized black and crumbly and will catch a spark almost instantly. The key is keeping your tinder and your fire steel dry. Moisture is the enemy. So these items were kept in pouches, made from materials like sealskin or fish skin, something naturally water-resistant. The fire steel and flint were valuable enough that they might be the only possessions a poor person owned besides the clothes on their back. Now here's something fascinating that speaks to the Norse understanding of chemistry and materials science. Even though they wouldn't have used those terms, they understood that certain woods burned differently. Oak burns slow and hot, creating excellent coals. It's the best wood for overnight fires, for creating that bed of coals that will last till morning. But oak is also valuable for construction, for shipbuilding. You don't want to burn too much of it. Birch burns faster and produces good heat, but it doesn't create the lasting coals that oak does. However, birch bark, that papery outer layer, is perhaps the most valuable fire-starting material in Scandinavia, even when wet birch bark will burn. It contains oils that make it naturally flammable. A few strips of birch bark, and your fire will go from spark to flame with remarkable speed. Pine and other conifers burn hot but fast, and they contain sap that can pop and throw sparks. You have to be careful with them, but in a desperate situation when you need heat, immediately, pine is your friend. They also understood the concept of wood seasoning without knowing the modern scientific explanation. Wood that's been cut and allowed to dry for a season or more burns more efficiently than green wood. Green wood contains too much water. Much of the heat energy goes into evaporating that water instead of warming your house. So throughout the summer and autumn, whenever men weren't busy with farm work, they'd be cutting and splitting wood. This wood would be stacked carefully, allowing air circulation, protecting it from rain, but letting wind dry it out. The amount of wood you had stacked up by the time winter arrived was literally the measure of your preparation, your likely survival odds. But fire was dangerous too. A longhouse constructed primarily of wood, insulated with dried grass and moss, with a roof of wooden shingles or thatch, was essentially a giant pile of kindling. One spark in the wrong place, one moment of inattention, and everything could go up in flames. House fires were genuinely terrifying. In the middle of winter, in the middle of the night, if your house catches fire, where do you go? The cold outside can kill you almost as surely as the flames. There are saga accounts of entire families dying this way, either in the fire or fleeing into the winter night without adequate clothing. So fire safety was a constant concern. The hearth was carefully constructed, usually with stones lining it with the earth around it, tamped and hardened. People were vigilant about not leaving flammable materials too close. Sparks from the fire were treated with respect, never ignored. Let's shift now to food preservation technologies, because you can't survive a 6-month winter on fresh food. Everything has to be preserved, and the Norse had several methods. Drying is the simplest. Meat and fish are cut into thin strips and hung in the smoke near the roof of the longhouse. The combination of smoke heat and air circulation slowly dries them out. The smoke also helps to preserve them and adds flavor. This dried meat and fish, while tough and requiring considerable chewing, is stable. It won't rot. It can last months. Salting is another method, particularly for fish. The Norse had access to sea salt from coastal operations. Fish would be split open, gutted, and packed in salt. The salt draws out moisture and creates an environment where bacteria can't thrive. Salt fish, properly prepared, could last a year or more. Fermentation was also used, though this is less well documented. We know from later periods that Scandinavians fermented fish, creating products that could be stored through the winter. The famous hakal fermented shark meat from Iceland is an example of this preservation technique, though whether it was practiced in the Viking Age proper is debated. But perhaps the most important preserved food was dairy, specifically cheese and butter. Milk production drops off dramatically in winter because the cows are indoors not getting fresh grass. So summer is when you're swimming in milk, and you need to preserve as much of that as possible. Cheese making is essentially controlled spoilage. You're using bacteria and enzymes to transform milk into a product that's stable, that won't rot quickly. The Norse made hard cheeses that could last months. These cheeses were dense, salty, probably quite strong tasting by modern standards, but they represented concentrated nutrition and protein. Butter was preserved in a different way. It was packed tightly into barrels or containers made from wood or even clay, pressed down to exclude air, sometimes with salt added. Buried in the cool earth of a cellar or even in a bog, this butter could last for extended periods. In fact, archaeologists have found ancient butter in Irish bogs that's centuries old, still preserved. Let me tell you about one more technology, one that's less about physical survival and more about mental survival games. The Norse played a board game called Hnefatafl, which translates roughly as King's Table. This game is fascinating because it's not symmetric like chess. One player has more pieces and is trying to capture the king. The other player has fewer pieces but is trying to get the king to safety to one of the corners of the board. The game is a metaphor for Norse warfare and politics. The king player is defending, trying to break through to safety. The attacker is trying to encircle and capture. It's a game of strategy and tactics, and it could occupy hours of a winter evening. Archaeological finds include beautifully crafted Hnefatafl sets with pieces carved from walrus ivory or jet. These weren't just toys. They were cultural artifacts, teaching tools that helped young men think strategically, that provided mental stimulation during the long months when physical activity was limited. Other games included dice games, though the rules are less clear from the archaeological evidence. What is clear is that gaming was taken seriously. There are saga accounts of disputes arising from games of friendships broken and made over game boards. They also had physical contests when weather permitted. Wrestling was popular, conducted on packed snow. Tests of strength like stone lifting. Even skiing, which served both as transportation and as sport. The Norse god Ulla was associated with skiing, and winter and prayers to Ulla for safe travel over snow were common. The point of all this technology, all these techniques, was not just to survive, but to make life livable, to create pockets of warmth and light and activity in the midst of darkness and cold, to give people reasons to keep going, to maintain social bonds, to stay sane. And here's what's remarkable: much of this technology, these solutions to the problems of winter survival, weren't written down. They were passed from generation to generation through demonstration and practice. A grandmother teaching a granddaughter how to prepare tinder fungus. A father showing a son how to judge if wood is dry enough to burn. A community of women sharing techniques for making the tightest, warmest weaves. This oral and practical transmission of knowledge is something we've largely lost in the modern world, where we expect everything to be written down, codified, searchable on the internet. But the Norse understood that some knowledge lives in the hands and the body, in muscle memory and accumulated experience. When we talk about winter survival skill, we're talking about this entire package of knowledge and technique and social practice. It's not any one thing. It's everything together. The right clothing, the right fire management, the right food preservation, the right mental strategies, the right social structures. Remove any one element, and the whole system becomes less stable. And that's why studying Viking winter survival isn't just an academic exercise in historical curiosity. It's a window into human adaptability, into our capacity to develop complex solutions to complex problems, into the ways that necessity drives innovation. These people didn't have electric heat or insulated houses or modern medicine. What they had was accumulated wisdom, careful observation, constant experimentation, and an unwillingness to give up. They had each other, and somehow, incredibly, it was enough. Now, we need to talk about something that might not seem immediately relevant to surviving the cold, but which was actually crucial social structure. How Norse society was organized, how power flowed, how people related to each other within these tight-knit winter communities. Because here's the thing, when you're trapped in a longhouse for months, when you're pressed against the same people night after night, when resources are scarce and tensions run high, the social bonds that hold the group together become just as important as the physical shelter that keeps you alive. The basic unit of Norse society was the household, but this wasn't the nuclear family as we know it. A household might include parents and children, yes, but also extended family, grandparents, unmarried or widowed aunts and uncles. Maybe a foster child or two, which was common in Norse culture. Possibly servants or thralls, which is the Norse word for slaves. Yes, the Vikings kept slaves. This is one of those uncomfortable historical facts that we need to acknowledge. Thralls were people captured in raids or born into slavery. They did the hardest work, had the lowest status, and lived the most precarious existence. In winter, when food might run short, the thralls ate last and least. But even within this hierarchical structure, there was a recognition of interdependence. The thrall who tended the fire kept everyone warm. The servant who tended the animals kept everyone fed. This created a kind of enforced cooperation. You couldn't afford to be too cruel to the people you depended on for survival. At the top of the household was the head of family, usually the father or the eldest male, though there's evidence of women controlling households in certain circumstances. This person had authority, but it wasn't absolute. Norse society had a strong tradition of decision-making by consensus, at least among free men. Major decisions, things that affected the whole household, would be discussed. In winter, around the fire, these discussions could go on for hours. Where to build a new outbuilding, whether to trade with neighbors for more food supplies, how to resolve a dispute with another farm, whether to support this jarl or that one in the complex political maneuvering of the region. Women in Norse society had more autonomy than in many other medieval cultures. A woman could own property, could divorce her husband under certain circumstances, could represent her household in legal matters if her husband was absent. And in the practical day-to-day running of a farm, especially in winter, women's work was absolutely essential. The division of labor was fairly rigid by our standards. Men's work involved the heaviest physical tasks, cutting wood, caring for large animals, repair work on buildings and tools. Women's work centered on textile production, food, preparation, dairy work, and supervising the household's daily operations. But there was also a recognition that in winter, everyone did what needed doing. If the cow was calving and the men were out checking snares well, the women delivered the calf. If a sudden storm required securing the outbuildings and the women were busy with urgent work inside, then the boys, even quite young boys, went out to do what needed doing. This flexibility within structure was key to survival. You had your expected roles, your normal responsibilities. But survival required pragmatism. It required everyone to be able to do multiple tasks to step in where needed. Now, beyond the individual household, there was the broader community structure. Farms in Norse Scandinavia weren't isolated. They were connected through networks of kinship, alliance trade, and obligation. Your nearest neighbors might be a few miles away, but you knew them. You were probably related to them, if not by blood, then by marriage. In winter, visiting between farms was less common simply because travel was difficult and dangerous. But it still happened. Important news had to be shared. Help might be needed. Social bonds had to be maintained. So there would be winter visits, usually carefully planned around weather and moon phase, because traveling at night without moonlight was asking for trouble. These visits were important social occasions. The traveler would bring news from other farms' gossip stories. They might bring small gifts or trade goods. In return, they'd receive hospitality, food, warmth, a place to sleep. This hospitality was more than just politeness. It was a sacred obligation in Norse culture. You took care of travelers, even strangers, because you never knew when you might be the traveler in need. But winter was also when the larger social structures of Norse society became important. I mentioned jarls earlier. These were local chieftains, men of wealth and power, who had followers who provided protection and leadership in return for loyalty and service. The jarl's hall was larger than a normal longhouse, more elaborate. This was where the community gathered for winter feasts, for religious ceremonies, for the administration of justice. These gatherings served multiple purposes. Politically, they reinforced the jarl's authority. His ability to provide food and warmth and entertainment for his people that demonstrated his power and justified their loyalty. If you couldn't provide, if your feast was shabby, if you ran out of food, well, people might start looking for a new leader. Economically, these gatherings were where deals were made, disputes were settled, trades were arranged. Winter was planning season. You'd discuss what you wanted to accomplish in the coming year, what resources you'd need, what help you might require from your neighbors. Socially, these gatherings maintained community cohesion. People who spent most of the winter isolated on their individual farms got to see each other, to hear news, to feel part of something larger than their own struggling household. This was crucial for mental health, for maintaining morale. Religiously, winter was a significant time. The midwinter blot, a sacrificial feast, was one of the most important ceremonies of the year. Animals would be slaughtered, offerings made to the gods. Feasting would go on for days. This served multiple functions. It was a religious observance, a social gathering, and a practical cull of animals that you might not be able to feed through the rest of winter anyway. Now I want to talk about something that might seem tangential, but which connects deeply to our theme, the Norse relationship with their environment, their understanding of nature and their place within it. The Norse didn't see nature as something separate from themselves, something to be conquered or tamed. They saw themselves as part of a larger system, subject to forces beyond their control. The gods themselves were subject to fate. Even Odin the Allfather knew that Ragnarok was coming, knew that the gods would eventually fall. This fatalism, this acceptance that there are limits to human power, it shaped how they approached winter survival. They didn't rage against the cold. They accepted it as inevitable, as part of the natural order. What they could control was their response to it, their preparation, their techniques and strategies. There's a concept in Norse thought called örlog, which is often translated as fate, but is more nuanced than that. It's the accumulated weight of past actions, the momentum of history, the patterns that shape the present. You can't escape your örlog, but you can face it with courage and dignity. This philosophical framework made winter suffering more bearable. It wasn't random. It wasn't a punishment. It was just the way things were. Winter came. You dealt with it. You did your best. If you died well, that was your urlog. If you survived, you'd have stories to tell, and another year of life. This might sound passive, even defeatist to modern ears, but it was actually quite liberating. If you accept that some things are beyond your control, you can focus your energy on the things you can control. You can't control when winter ends. You can control how much wood you've cut, how much food you've stored, how well you've maintained your house and tools. Let me tie this back to something we discussed earlier, the shift from cattle to sheep in Icelandic feasting culture. This wasn't just an environmental adaptation. It was also a social and political one. As the Icelandic environment became less able to support the old Norwegian model of power, based on lavish displays of wealth and hospitality, the society had to change. The chieftain system gradually gave way to more complex forms of governance. The Commonwealth period in Iceland, roughly 930 to 1262 CE, saw the development of an assembly system, the Althing, where free men met to make laws and resolve disputes. This was a society adapting not just to environmental constraints, but to the social pressures those constraints created. When no one could afford to maintain the old lavish standards, when everyone was struggling just to survive, new forms of cooperation and governance had to emerge. And here's the parallel with our earlier discussion of Lincoln societies. Don't just survive harsh winters through physical means. They survive through adaptation of their social structures, their values, their understanding of what's important. The American frontier created a society that valued self-reliance, but also mutual aid. Your neighbor might be miles away, but when you needed help, they'd come. When they needed help, you'd go. This wasn't altruism exactly. It was enlightened self-interest. Today's helper might be tomorrow's person in need. Similarly, Viking winter survival created a society that valued loyalty, hospitality, and communal bonds. You took care of your people. You didn't let your neighbors freeze or starve if you could help it. Not just because it was morally right, though, that was part of it, but because social bonds were wealth. Your network of relationships, of kinship and alliance and mutual obligation, that was how you survived. This brings us to something that anthropologists and sociologists call social capital. It's a modern term for an ancient concept, the value of human relationships and networks. In a modern economy, financial capital matters most. Money in the bank stocks, bonds, property. But in subsistence, societies where everyone is on the edge of survival, social capital can matter more than any other kind. If your house burns down, financial capital won't help you immediately. You need shelter now, tonight. But social capital will. Your relatives take you in. Your neighbors bring food. Your community helps you rebuild. These relationships, built up over years, maintained through countless small interactions, they're what save you. The Norse understood this implicitly. Winter, with its forced proximity and shared hardship, was when social capital was built and tested. The Jarl who fed his people through a hard winter earned loyalty that might last decades. The neighbor who shared food when your supplies ran short, you remembered that. You'd return the favor someday. But social capital can also be destroyed, and winter was when that destruction might happen. Disputes that simmered in the summer when people were too busy to really engage with them, these could erupt in winter. Trapped together, tensions could escalate. Feuds could start over seemingly minor issues. The sagas are full of stories about winter feuds. Often they start with something trivial, an insult, a perceived slight, someone taking more than their fair share. But in the pressure cooker of a winter longhouse, these things could explode into violence. This is why social rituals, social expectations, codes of conduct were so important. Everyone knew how they were supposed to behave. Everyone knew the consequences of violating social norms. You didn't insult your host. You didn't shirk your share of work. You didn't make advances towards someone else's wife. These weren't just moral rules. They were survival rules. Break them, and you might find yourself alone in the cold, expelled from the community that kept you alive. Now let's come back to our longhouse. You're lying there in the darkness, surrounded by your family. And as you listen to the breathing, the small sounds of the night, you're aware that these people, these bodies pressed against yours, they're your world. For the next several months, this is it. This is your society, your economy, your entertainment, your everything. How you relate to these people, how you negotiate disputes and share resources and maintain affection and respect, that determines the quality of your life more than almost any physical factor. You could have the warmest house and the most food, but if your social bonds are damaged, if the atmosphere in the house is one of tension and resentment, your winter will be miserable. So there's an invisible work happening alongside all the physical work of survival. There's the work of maintaining relationships, of being patient with children who are bored and restless, of showing respect to elders even when they're repetitive or difficult, of sharing spaces and resources gracefully, of finding ways to entertain each other, to make each other laugh, to remind each other why life is worth living. This is perhaps the most sophisticated winter survival skill of all, the ability to maintain community and kindness and basic human decency in conditions that test you every day. And they did it. Generation after generation, for centuries they did it. They raised children who learned these skills and passed them on. They created a culture that not only survived, but thrived, that produced art and literature and technology and exploration. When we think about the Vikings, we often think about the raids, the violence, the dramatic sagas of heroes and battles. But the real story, the real achievement was this: they survived the winters. They kept themselves and their children alive year after year in one of the harshest environments humans have ever inhabited. And they did it not through individual heroism, but through collective effort, through social bonds, through a deep understanding that we're all in this together. That's the lesson that resonates across the centuries. That's what makes their story relevant even now in our modern world, where winter is an inconvenience rather than a threat. Because we still need community. We still need social bonds. We still need to remember that our survival, our thriving, depends on our relationships with others. The Norse knew this in their bones. Winter taught it to them every year. And it's something that perhaps we, in our centrally heated homes, with our fully stocked refrigerators, could stand to remember. We're coming to the end of our journey now. The longest part of the night has passed. And just as those Viking families would begin to sense the approach of dawn, we're beginning to return from that cold, dark place to the warmth and safety of your modern bed. But before we fully return, I want us to linger just a moment longer in that longhouse. Because there's something profoundly moving about imagining those final hours before dawn that transition from the darkest part of night to the first grey light. You're lying there under your furs, and you've been drifting in and out of sleep for hours. Your body is tired, but also restless. Your back aches from the hard sleeping bench. Your shoulder is numb from lying on it too long. But you're warm enough, or warm enough to survive, and that's what matters. Around you, the sounds of your family. Your father's deep breathing. Your mother is shifting position. Your little sister mumbling something in her sleep. Your grandmother coughing softly, that chronic cough she's had all winter. These sounds are your world. They're annoying sometimes, yes, but they're also deeply comforting. As long as you can hear these sounds, everyone's alive. Everyone made it through another night. The fire is low now, just coals, but you can sense them there, that faint heat, that dim red glow if you look toward the center of the house. Someone will need to get up soon to add wood to start rebuilding the fire for morning. Maybe it'll be you. Maybe you'll be the one to brave the cold interior of the house, to add those first pieces of wood that will bring light and warmth back into this space. But not yet. For now, you're still in this in-between state, this liminal time that's neither fully night nor yet day. And there's something peaceful about it, something almost sacred. The world is quiet. The wind has died down. The storm, if there was one, has passed. Everything feels suspended, waiting. This is when thoughts come. Not the practical thoughts of the day, the endless mental lists of tasks and worries, but deeper thoughts, reflective thoughts. You think about the people around you, about how much you depend on them, and they on you. You think about the winter, how much longer it might last. You remember winters past, both the terrible ones and the ones that weren't so bad. You remember the winter when you were small, when the snow was so deep that your father had to dig a tunnel to the barn to feed the animals. You remember the winter when your grandfather died peacefully in his sleep, and how the ground was frozen too hard to bury him, so his body had to wait wrapped in furs until spring. You remember good winters, 2 winters with enough food, with good health, with laughter and stories around the fire. These memories, this sense of continuity, this understanding that you're part of something larger than yourself, larger than this one winter. This is part of what makes survival possible. You're not just enduring for yourself, you're enduring for your children, for the generations that will come after. You're maintaining a tradition, a way of life, a culture that's been passed down and will be passed forward. The thought gives you strength. It makes the cold the discomfort. The endless days of winter seem more bearable. You're part of a chain, a lineage. Your grandparents survived winters like this. Your parents did. Now it's your turn. Someday, your children will tell their children about these winters, about the time when survival was something you earned every single day. And then, almost imperceptibly, something changes. The quality of the darkness shifts. It's still dark, too dark to see anything clearly, but it's a different kind of dark. The blackness is maybe just slightly less absolute. Your mind, trained by thousands of mornings, just like this one, recognizes it, even though your eyes can barely detect it. Dawn is approaching. Around you, others are starting to stir. Someone sits up. You hear the rustle of furs being pushed aside, bare feet hitting the floor, someone moving toward the hearth, the scrape of wood being added to the coals, the crackle as dry bark catches, the first small flames, and suddenly there's light, real light, dancing, flickering, beautiful light. The interior of the longhouse becomes visible. You can see the rafters dark with smoke. You can see the sleeping benches with their lumpy shapes of sleeping people. You can see your breath great clouds of vapor catching the firelight. You can see frost on the inside of the walls, where moisture has frozen overnight. But most of all, you can see faces. Your mother's face as she bends over the fire, coaxing it to life. Your father's face weathered and lined, but familiar as he pulls on his boots. Your siblings emerging from their own piles of furs, yawning, stretching, complaining about the cold, but also relieved to have made it through another night. Everyone's alive. Everyone's okay. You did it. You survived. And now comes the morning work, getting the fire built up properly, starting water heating for morning drinks, checking on the animals, making decisions about the day. Is it safe to go out? What work needs doing? What can wait? But there's also in these morning hours a kind of gentle joy. You're tired, yes. You're cold, yes. But you're alive. And there's something beautiful about that simple fact. Another day, another chance. The winter isn't over, but you've made it through one more night of it. The children, once they're fully awake, might play. Even in winter, even in these conditions, children find ways to play. Maybe they make little figures out of scraps of wool and wood. Maybe they play a game with pebbles. Maybe they just chase each other around the longhouse until their mother tells them to settle down. The adults go about their morning routines with practiced efficiency. Everyone knows their roles. The work gets done not quickly exactly, but steadily. And as the morning progresses, as the fire builds and the house warms slightly, as people eat their morning meal and start to feel more human, there's conversation. Not profound conversation necessarily. Just the comfortable talk of people who know each other deeply, who've survived countless mornings, just like this one together. Maybe someone tells a joke. Maybe someone shares a dream they had. Maybe there's a brief argument about something trivial quickly resolved, because everyone's too tired to really fight. Maybe they're singing old songs that everyone knows, songs that have been sung on cold winter mornings for generations. This is life. This is human life stripped down to its essentials. Work and rest. Cold and warmth. Darkness and light. Fear and relief. Community and survival. It's simple, but it's also profound. And now, let's start to return to your time, to your world. Let's leave that Viking longhouse behind. Let's walk forward through the centuries. As we move forward, we see winters changing. We see technology developing. We see societies transforming. But we also see continuities. We see people still huddling around fires. We see families still depending on each other. We see communities still finding ways to survive harsh conditions through cooperation and ingenuity. We pass through medieval Europe, where winter is still a challenge, but where technology is slowly improving. Better heating systems, more efficient agriculture, trade networks that can bring food from warmer regions. We pass through the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution. We see coal replacing wood. We see cities growing with their own winter challenges, different from the rural ones, but no less real. We see the American frontier, where families like the Lincolns face winters that would have been familiar to the Vikings. Different setting, different culture, but the same essential challenge survive. The cold, keep your people alive. Make it to spring. We move through the 19th century, the 20th, seeing central heating spread, seeing electric lights banish darkness, seeing modern medicine reduce the toll that winter used to take on the young and old. And we arrive here now in your time, where winter for most of you is manageable. An inconvenience maybe, but not a threat. You have thermostats and grocery stores and electric lights. You have technology that those Viking families couldn't have imagined. But you also have something else. You have the legacy of all those people who came before. You have the accumulated wisdom and ingenuity and strength that made your comfortable modern life possible. You are the inheritors of centuries of winter survival skill, even if you never have to use it. And maybe that's worth remembering. Maybe, as you lie in your warm bed, in your safe house, with your full refrigerator just down the hall, maybe you can take a moment to appreciate it. Not in a guilty way, but in a grateful way. You are living a life that your ancestors would have considered miraculous. You have gifts they couldn't dream of. But you also have something in common with them. You're still human. You still need community. You still need purpose. You still need connection. The challenges you face are different, but the core needs are the same. When you feel isolated, remember that Viking family huddled together. When you feel cold and alone, remember that they found warmth in each other. When you wonder if you can endure, remember that countless generations before you endured worse and not only survived, but thrived. You carry their strength in you, their stubbornness, their refusal to give up, their ability to find light in darkness and warmth in cold. That's your inheritance. That's your birthright as a human being. So as we fully return now to your present moment, to your comfortable bed, to your safe room, carry this knowledge with you. You are part of an unbroken chain of humans who have faced winter and survived. You are the latest chapter in a story that stretches back thousands of years. And maybe tomorrow, when you wake up warm and safe, you'll have a slightly different appreciation for that warmth, for that safety. Maybe you'll understand in a deeper way what a gift it is. Maybe you'll feel connected across the centuries to all those people who fought for survival, and one whose victory is your comfortable modern life. That's what history can do when we really let it in. It can make us grateful. It can make us humble. It can make us stronger by reminding us where we came from and what we're capable of. The Vikings survived their winters. Lincoln survived his frontier childhood. Countless others, whose names we don't know, survived challenges we can barely imagine. And you're surviving your own challenges, whatever they might be. Rest now. Sleep well. You've earned it just as they earned their rest after long winter nights. You're safe. You're warm. You're part of a long story that continues. And tomorrow, when you wake, the winter will still be there, whatever form your winter takes. But you'll face it with the strength of all those who came before. You'll face it as humans have always faced winter, with courage, with community, with the stubborn insistence that spring will come. Well, we've reached the end of our journey together. We've spent these hours in that Viking longhouse experiencing something of what winter survival meant in those cold, dark months. I hope you found it interesting. I hope even more that you found it relaxing, that it helped you drift towards sleep. Before we part, I want to thank you for spending this time with me, creating these videos, these long, slow journeys through history. It's something I care deeply about. There's so much noise in the world, so much that's harsh and quick and demanding. I wanted to create something different, something that moves at a human pace, that gives you space to think and feel and just be. If you enjoyed this, if you found value in it, I'd be grateful if you'd consider supporting the channel. Like the video if you found it worthwhile. Subscribe if you'd like to see more content like this. leave a comment about what resonated with you, what you'd like to see in future videos. And tell me, where are you right now? As you're listening to this, what time is it? What's winter like where you are? Are you in a place where winter is a real force, something that shapes your life? Or is winter mild, just a change of season? I'm genuinely curious. This feels like a conversation, even though I'm the only one speaking, and I'd love to hear from you. I want to leave you with one final thought. The Vikings had a concept they called sisu, though that's actually a Finnish word that entered the Scandinavian languages later. But the concept is old. It means something like stoic determination or strength of will. It's the ability to keep going when things are hard, when everything in you wants to quit, when surrender would be easier. Those long winter nights, that's where sisu was forged. That's where people learned what they were capable of. And while you might never face their exact challenges, you have your own winters, your own dark nights, your own tests. Remember when you face them that you come from a long line of survivors. That strength is in you. That capacity for endurance is part of your inheritance as a human being. Now rest. Let yourself drift. Let the weight of the day fall away. You're safe. You're warm. Tomorrow will bring what it brings. But right now, in this moment, you can simply be. Thank you for joining me tonight. I'm Peter Miller, and I'll be here whenever you need another journey through history. Sleep well, dream well, and wake refreshed, ready for whatever your tomorrow holds. Good night.